Rupert Wegerif is with the Digital Education Futures Initiative at the University of Cambridge, and he argues that a focus on teaching critical thinking should be paramount. Critical thinking, he says, is essentially dialogue, and so the best way to teach a student how to think is to engage them in dialogue.
One of the things we found empirically, for example, is that if you get young primary kids, about 8, 9, 10, to talk together effectively around reasoning tests, they will individually improve their ability to solve reasoning tests. And it was fairly clear that what was going on was that they were internalizing dialogue. So they had a kind of voice in their head saying, why do you think that? Have you considered the alternatives? They internalized this after engaging in dialogue with others. So the idea is that our internal, shall we say, higher order thinking, the reflective thinking that we are looking for when we're trying to teach critical thinking, for example, is an internalized dialogue. In other words, there has to be some kind of tension between different perspectives that motivate reflection and creative insights.
You're very positive about the potential of generative AI to help people think more effectively. Explain your reasoning. What is it about AI that you think has this power or this potential?
Well, it's partly from personal experience. I'm a professor at Cambridge, and yet my dialogues with AI are expanding my range of insight into different issues. So it seems to me it obviously has great potential. And then when I compare that with all the accounts I read of how it's dumbing people down, I think that's interesting, but that's not necessarily indicative of the potential of AI. That's indicative of the way in which people are using it to fit into a pre-existing system. Obviously, if students have to get marks to succeed and the AI can do it better than them, they're going to rely on the AI, and rather obviously that'll mean that they don't develop the skills for themselves. So clearly what we need to do is motivate students to have passions, to have interests, to have curiosity, and when they have that motivation, the AI is, I was going to say a servant for a minute. That's obviously the wrong one. I don't know. It just sounds like a dodgy word, doesn't it? But clearly the AI is their assistant, helping them to achieve their learning goals. So I find that quite exciting because it implies that we really have to shift our emphasis in education away from teaching students a preset menu of things that other people have already discovered and towards encouraging them to think and learn for themselves. I'm not for a minute suggesting that we can abandon all that knowledge. I just think that the AI will force us to promote students' interests and engagement in learning.
The arrival of generative AI has made many educational institutions start to question the essay or the written assignment as a measure of learning. Your thoughts about that? Is that a good thing?
Yes. I've noticed certainly here at Cambridge, for example, people seem to imagine that writing a cunningly crafted essay that compares and contrasts and comes up with a personal synthesis is somehow the essence of good thinking. I suspect that it's probably more like a reflection of their particular cultural background and tradition. They've all learned how to write essays at schools and so on. And essays are, beautiful piece of cultural artifact sometimes, but it's not the only way to demonstrate that you're thinking. Plenty of more oral cultures and indeed oral people who use language for dialogue and reflection can think extremely well without knowing really how to craft a Cambridge essay. So I think a lot of what we've been teaching with the pretense that we're teaching some kind of universal thinking skill has just been a particular cultural tradition, and I think the AI punctures some of those assumptions and challenges us to look at the reality of good thinking beyond that particular Oxbridge type framing.
So does that mean a return to oral traditions of learning, the type of thing that existed in the past before we became so focused on writing and the printed document?
Well, I think it probably does, and obviously it's not a simple return, you might call it return at a higher level, because clearly we can now build on all the amazing achievements of print-based education, the fact that we have this global cumulative body of knowledge that we call science, for example. We're not trying to abandon that, but the focus on the written medium as a medium, a focus of education and a focus of developing thinking, has particular affordances that are perhaps a bit narrow, and we shouldn't ignore the tremendous affordance for thinking of real oral face-to-face dialogues. So in oral traditions, you have this more embodied, more situated, more holistic approach where you have to really listen and respond to a range of different perspectives. And I think the AI can help us to return to what I would say is that deeper understanding of intelligence, of real embodied intelligence that solves real-world problems. And real-world problems are always quite complex. They're not just the sort of things that you can learn about through books entirely. And so, yeah, I find that quite exciting.
Given what you said about dialogue, the importance of dialogue, how do you make assessments on that? How do you introduce that kind of learning into an educational system?
Well, did you know that, for example, in a university like Cambridge, where I'm speaking from, until quite recently, the last couple of hundred years, all assessments were oral. Written assessments replaced the oral viva voces, but we still have viva voces for PhDs. The reason why we can't have oral assessment in all areas is because it's kind of time consuming and people think it's not very standardized. But now I see a tremendous potential for AI chatbots to bring back that kind of oral assessment. I think a relatively short and friendly chat with a particular bot, and we haven't developed them yet, but I am working on this with a range of partners, this idea, taking it forward, could tell you what your level of knowledge was in mathematics, in history, in any area, in a way that was not quite so fraught as the standardized test, and that was more accurate and more standardized. So I wonder if we might not return to this tradition of oral assessments that we abandoned only, relatively recently, but using the technology to do that.
And you're with Future Tense, an ABC Radio National production. I'm Anthony Fennell.